Westchester County, New York is situated just north of New York City. It has long been considered as a pretty safe and idyllic respite from the sprawl of the big city, and it prides itself on being a family town. However, the events that took place in Westchester County in the spring of 1984 to the spring of 1985 were so macabre that they inspired aspects of the Thomas Harris novel Silence of the Lambs. On July 16, 1984, a 12-year-old girl named Antonella Mattina disappeared. Antonella was precocious and caring, so she offered to run some errands for her mother. Initially, her mother was reluctant, but her daughter insisted, claiming that she was a big girl now, and that she simply wanted to help out more. Finally, her mother gave in and sent Antonella to cash a check on her behalf. But when she realized that she'd been gone for over an hour, the mother started to panic. She called her husband and he came home early with their son Leo, and together the family went out looking for Antonella. After a couple of hours with no luck, they contacted the police. Eyewitnesses confirmed that Antonella had entered the bank, but no one had seen her after she left. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a full year before any light would finally be shed on the case. Close to a year later, on February 24, 1985, Officer Stymiloski conducted a traffic stop that would prove to be his last. The young officer was recently engaged to be married, and he was just 27 years old. At around 7 p.m, Gary pulled over a 1972 blue Mercury Capri. It had hand-painted Ghostbusters decals on the bumper. He pulled it for reckless driving. He then radioed for a tow truck to impound the car. This was because the driver did not have a license, nor did he have insurance. And then Stymiloski found shotguns and ammunition in the vehicle, so he called for backup. At the time, the driver had 3 associates in the car, 2 male and 1 female. They later reported that the driver claimed that Stymiloski was giving him a hard time, and that he was gonna kill this cop. The associates claimed that they thought he was joking, but just a few moments later, the driver produced a handgun from under his seat, and he pulled the trigger 3 times aimed at the officer. Gary Stymiloski lost the fight for his life. Just 2 days later, on February 26, 1985, Beverly Capone was reported missing. Beverly worked at IBM and drove a white Toyota that she had recently bought for herself. Her colleague recounted that when she was leaving the office that day, Beverly told her, "I'm taking these old bones right home." Beverly was of Irish descent and she was known for being feisty and assertive. This was despite her petite stature. She was barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. While she and her husband were divorced, they still remained great friends, and Beverly was extremely close to her daughter Pamela too. Pamela, who was 22 at the time, had tried to get hold of her mother all day. She'd left messages on her machine, but by the time 9 p.m. rolled around, she had still heard nothing back. So now she knew that something was wrong. She called her father, and initially he said she shouldn't worry. Maybe Beverly had just gone out with friends, or she was maybe working late. But Pamela knew her mother, and she felt unsettled. She had that feeling in her gut that we so often speak about. The daughter forced herself to put those bad thoughts aside for a little longer, but she then reported her mother missing the very next day. In the 2 days between Officer Stymiloski's murder and Beverly Capone's disappearance, a lot had transpired. But to really understand the timeline of events, we have to go back to the fateful night of the routine traffic stop. A man named Alex Mengel was driving the car that Officer Stymiloski pulled over for reckless driving. Mengel was a Guyanese immigrant who worked as a security guard, as well as a tool and die maker, and he spent a lot of time between the Bronx and Westchester, New York. Mengel and his 3 associates were heading back from a hunting trip in the Catskill Mountains when they were pulled over. Mengel, as we know, was agitated by the stop, and ultimately he was the one to pull the trigger. Before the murder, however, as he pulled out his handgun, he instructed his associates to drive his Mercury Capri, complete with Ghostbuster decals, over to the Bronx as soon as they heard the shot. Mengel's motive for the murder seemed kind of vague. It wasn't just because he was angry. In his mind, he had good reason. It was later revealed that Mengel had a criminal record, a record that would have almost certainly seen him be arrested by Stymiloski. Firstly, there was ammunition and shotguns in the truck. Secondly, Alex Mengel was an illegal immigrant. And finally, he was a perpetrator of domestic violence. Around a year prior, only a few months before Antonella's disappearance, on May the 2nd, 1994, a woman showed up at a Westchester County emergency room with a broken jaw. This woman was Mengel's wife. Initially, she told medical staff that she had been mugged, but eventually she broke down, finally revealing that her husband had been beating her for years. His wife was essentially Mengel's first confirmed victim. Because of this, he was arrested, but he did not go to jail. This specific crime was taken far less seriously at the time. Thankfully though, his wife is one of the first women in New York history to be put in a pilot program for survivors. Her last name was changed, she was housed in protection, and Mengel was never allowed to see her ever again. He was, however, allowed supervised contact with his son, but only in specified locations. But back to the traffic stop. As instructed after hearing the shot, the three associates drove Mengel's car to the Bronx. Mengel then stole the cop car with the wounded officer still in the front seat, and he headed in the opposite direction and then abandoned the car. Mengel lays Officer Stymiloski across the front seats, leaving him to bleed out, and then he stole his handgun before fleeing. However, he was unable to turn off the flashing police light on top of the car, and this failure captured the attention of another police officer. They eventually found the abandoned car, and sadly, Stymiloski's body. Meanwhile, the cops at Stymiloski called for backup arrived at the scene of the traffic stop, and with no Stymiloski, no police vehicle, and no Mercury Capri to be found, a search quickly followed. Around the Bronx, it was common knowledge that Mengel drove a car with hand-painted Ghostbuster decals on it, so officials soon had at least one suspect in the murder of Officer Stymiloski. I mean, you couldn't really make yourself much more obvious, could you? At this point, Mengel had run across the highway, and he was now hiding out in a shed at the Yonkers Motor Inn. This was confirmed when a young female shop worker later reported that Mengel had entered her convenience store. She was working the register for her parents, and said that a very sweaty and out-of-breath Mengel had come in. He purchased a soda and was carrying something wrapped up in a shirt or a towel. Simultaneously, Mengel's Mercury Capri was discovered abandoned in the Bronx. A local crime unit in the Bronx started off by surveilling the car. 3 hours passed by and no one approached the vehicle, so they changed tactics. They then decided to start searching the block that Mengel's car was found on. However, because this particular neighborhood is known for substance-related crimes, they had to wait for backup to arrive first. Authorities knocked on doors with emergency service units from NYC and canine units in tow. They took Mengel's car in to look for evidence and they questioned whoever they could. They eventually stumbled upon an acquaintance of the perpetrator. They revealed that Mengel had been up in the Catskill Mountains with a few friends. This was the three associates in the car, along with one other person who had driven back in his own car. Police found all of these friends and took them in for questioning. At first, the friends, later dubbed the Bronx Four by author David Paul, remained tight-lipped. But after a very intense interrogation, which saw one of the friends being held out of a window, they finally snapped and revealed that Mengel had, in fact, murdered Gary Stymiloski. On February the 29th, 1985, 3 days after Beverly Capone's disappearance, a young girl was approached by someone in a white Toyota. The girl was delivering newspapers on her paper route in a suburban neighborhood. That is when the woman in the car called her over, asking for directions. The girl got closer to the car and then noticed that the woman was actually a man. He was wearing an ill-fitting wig, along with women's clothing. The girl backed away when the driver pointed a handgun at her. He threatened to end her life if she didn't get in the car. Amazingly though, the girl managed to escape by running to a neighbor's driveway and that neighbour then contacted the police. The police showed the young girl a series of photographs, and she immediately identified Alex Mengel as a person who had threatened her. The manhunt was now officially on. He must still be nearby. Police located a relative of Mengel's near where the incident with the young girl had taken place. This was close to Buffalo City. They discovered that Mengel was desperately trying to make his way up to Canada, and they now knew that he was driving a white Toyota. By this point, the news about Beverly Capone was all over the country. This included her photograph and the details of her car, which was also a white Toyota. Pretty quickly, police suspect that Mengel, the confirmed cop killer, was connected to the Beverly Capone case as well. They put out a wanted notification throughout the country and Canada for Alex Mengel. On March 2, 1985, a white Toyota was spotted driving in the suburbs of Toronto. It was the white Toyota with Beverly's license plate still intact. Driving the car was Alex Mengel. He was now finally under arrest, but the vile details of his crimes were still to be discovered. In the car, they found that Beverly's driver's license had been altered, and then they discovered what was believed to be the wig. Until further inspection, the hair was actually attached to skin. It was the scalp of Beverly Capone. And almost unbelievably, this wasn't the worst thing they found in that car. Also laying in the vehicle was Beverly Capone's face. Mengel had been trying to use it as a disguise along with the altered license and her hair. Beverly's body was eventually found 11 days after her disappearance on March 4, 1985. The remains were found near Mengel's cabin in the Catskill Mountains. Her time on this earth was ended after a sharp implement pierced her heart. Biological evidence matched the remains found in the white Toyota on the day that Mengel was arrested. Mengel's car, the DIY Ghostbuster Mercury Capri, was also examined for evidence. Hidden inside the ashtray by the dashboard, police found several photographs of young women, as well as a map that had particular locations circled. These images comprised of 4 wallet-sized photographs and 1 Polaroid. Unfortunately, even though they were compared to missing cases and homicide incidents, no identifications of these women have ever been made to date. Still, police suspect these photographs indicate either victims or potential victims of Mengel. After being arrested on March 26, 1985, Canadian authorities ordered Mengel's deportation back to New York City. There, he would be charged and tried for the murder of Beverly Capone and Gary Stymiloski. En route back to the United States, Mengel tried to escape his fate once more. He attacked his police escort and attempted to grab his sidearm. A struggle ensued which would result in the death of 1 person in the vehicle. The officer driving the car quickly pulled over and leapt into action. He attempted valiantly to save the life of his partner in a moment of panic and heroism. The struggle continued, and 1 shot rang out. One of the men was hit in the chest. Their time on this earth ended almost instantly. That man was Alex Mengel. 2 years later, on Thanksgiving Day 1987, remains were found in a shallow grave in Yorktown, New York. The remains belonged to Antonella Mattina. She had vanished a year before Beverly Capone whilst running the errand for her mother. Her cause of death was ruled as multiple sharp implement wounds to the chest. Given the nature of Mengel's previous crimes, authorities suspect he was behind Antonella's murder as well. Police would make a horrifying statement, one that perhaps gives more weight to the actions of the officer that pulled the trigger defending his colleague in the police car. They believed that if he were not arrested when he was, Mengel displayed all the makings of a serial killer, and the police officer may have put an end to what could have been one of the worst reigns of terror ever seen in the United States.